So we'll be beginning our second panel, which has the title Gender and Gender Participation. Gender and Gender Participation. There are three speakers on this panel. Gabriela Cano from El Colegio de Mexico, Margaret Chowning from here, from the UC Berkeley, and Edward Wright-Rios from Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. Our first speaker is Gabriela Cano, who's recently joined the Gender Studies program at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. She's a distinguished historian of gender, women's, and other issues in Mexico. She's the co-editor with Veronica Radkau of Ganando Espacios, Historias de Vida, with three women's names following that. Cuatro estudios de género en el México urbano del siglo XIX. And she's a co-editor with Mary Kay Vaughan and Jocelyn Olcott of a book of essays called Sex in Revolution, Gender, Politics, and Power in Modern Mexico. And her latest book is called Se llamaba Elena Arizmendi, which has just come out. Did you bring any copies of the book with you? Oh, well, there you go. Look, it's a real opportunity to pick up books. It's better than going to Lhasa. Cheaper. So it's with a great deal of pleasure, le doy la palabra a la doctora Gabriela Cano, que expondrá en español, pero despacio. Muy bien, gracias.
First, I want to thank the invitation to be in this group of distinguished scholars. All the papers are fascinating. I want to thank especially Charles, Margaret, and Liz. And I also want to thank everybody who's here this Friday afternoon, who is going to be patient enough to listen to my paper in Spanish. I can answer questions and discuss in English, hopefully. ¿Es posible hacer la historia de las mujeres en la Revolución Mexicana? ¿Es posible hacer una historia de las mujeres? La segunda pregunta fue planteada por la historiadora francesa Michelle Perrot en una de las obras fundadoras del proyecto intelectual y político de colocar a las mujeres en el centro de las narraciones históricas. La respuesta afirmativa a ese interrogante se encuentra en las aportaciones de historiadoras de distintas generaciones y países que han hecho del campo de este campo una de las especialidades más ricas de la historiografía mundial en las últimas décadas. En un libro reciente, la propia Perrot hizo una reseña del campo de la historia de las mujeres en Francia y otras autoras han hecho lo propio para la historiografía de América Latina. La pregunta que hoy propongo, ¿es posible hacer la historia de las mujeres en la Revolución Mexicana?, surge ante su presente invisibilidad en muchos espacios. Más que ningún otro tema de la historia de América Latina, la Revolución Mexicana ha sido objeto de una historiografía tan abundante y muy abundante y metodológicamente refinada. Sin embargo, solo hasta fechas recientes, la historia de las mujeres mexicanas se ha dejado de desdeñar como un empecinamiento romántico femenino dirigido a la búsqueda de pequeños grupos de actores en lugares oscuros. Y el interés académico por el movimiento revolucionario y sus consecuencias por fin ha abarcado a las mujeres. Aunque con retraso, el refinamiento metodológico ha llegado a los estudios sobre las mujeres en la Revolución Mexicana y ha dado lugar a novedosas investigaciones que han mostrado las formas como el Estado, la guerra, los mercados, la familia, el trabajo y las prácticas de consumo, entre otros aspectos de la sociedad, moldean y a la vez están moldeados por el género, es decir, por el conocimiento aceptado pero siempre discutido sobre la diferencia entre los sexos que norma las relaciones entre hombres y mujeres. Los enfoques de género han permitido dejar atrás la perdurable como equivocada noción de que las mujeres fueron un actor social unitario del proceso revolucionario. Esa arraigada visión de la presencia o participación revolucionaria de las mujeres como un actor único ha pasado por alto los criterios de regionalización y estratificación socioeconómica, entre otros elementos metodológicos empleados provechosamente desde hace décadas por las interpretaciones revisionistas y postrevisionistas del proceso de la Revolución Mexicana. Mi optimismo frente a la aparente consolidación de los estudios de género sobre la historia de la Revolución Mexicana se detiene cuando observo que el interés por valorar las contribuciones de las mujeres a la historia en este año de conmemoraciones del 2010 se ha dirigido específicamente a las mujeres de la independencia. Se ha prestado especial atención a Leona Vicario y a la corregidora Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez. Ambas personalidades han sido objeto de obras que sería muy largo enumerar aquí, pero se trata de obras rigurosas, históricas y obras de ficción, la mayor parte de ellos de excelente factura. También se han escrito libros sobre mujeres insurgentes poco conocidas. Sin embargo, no deja de ser sorprendente que en este 2010 las mujeres de la Revolución Mexicana no hayan casi suscitado interés de editores, historiadores y escritores académicos y populares, y salvo alguna excepción, las instituciones de los distintos niveles del gobierno tampoco han organizado, han incluido a las mujeres en sus proyectos conmemorativos. Este 2010 ha enfatizado a las figuras que se constituyeron como heroínas en las fiestas del centenario en 1910, Leona Vicario y la corregidora. En ese año, Género García publicó una biografía sobre Vicario en la que el cronista, bibliógrafo y defensor de los derechos individuales de las mujeres hace gala de un rigor documental poco frecuente en las biografías heroicas. Los rituales de la memoria que se llevaron a cabo hace un siglo incluyeron la colocación de una placa conmemorativa en la casa donde falleció doña Leona y la celebración de una ceremonia cívica en la escuela primaria que llevaba su nombre. También se develó una estatua de Josefa Ortiz y se inauguró una escuela con el nombre de la esposa del corregidor Domínguez. Paralelamente a las ediciones oficiales del centenario de 10, se publicó el libro Mujeres Notables, una recopilación póstuma en 2 volúmenes de las biografías que la escritora Laureana Wright de Klein-Heinz, que a pesar de tener esos apellidos nació en Tasco, Guerrero, había publicado en la prensa a lo largo de su vida. García quizás fue el anónimo recopilador de esas biografías de más de 100 mujeres, entre las cuales figuran cacicas indígenas, monjas, mujeres insurgentes, escritoras y hasta una heroína de la ciencia. El desdén hacia las mujeres de la Revolución llama la atención en memorias en momentos en que las mujeres adquieren cada vez mayor visibilidad en todo tipo de actividades, incluido la esfera política, que ha sido una de las más reacias al acceso de las mujeres. ¿Cómo explicar ese poco interés por las mujeres del periodo revolucionario? No creo que pueda resolver esta pregunta en los 15 minutos que me quedan. Solo quiero comentar que parte de la explicación radica en la figura de la Adelita. La idealización y omnipresencia de esta figura es uno de los motivos de la casi total invisibilidad de las mujeres revolucionarias. Me explico. Cuando me refiero a la Adelita, no quiero menospreciar de ninguna manera la importancia de las mujeres rurales que se hicieron cargo de la infraestructura de los ejércitos combatientes, tanto el ejército federal como los ejércitos revolucionarios. De hecho, gracias al buen trabajo de historiadores de la fotografía como John Brass, que está aquí con nosotros, hoy sabemos que la emblemática fotografía que nos hizo favor de mostrar hace un rato de la soldadera que se asoma desde el tren, fue captada por el fotógrafo Jerónimo Hernández en la estación de Buenavista durante el gobierno constitucional de Madero. No sabemos, sin embargo, el nombre de la soldadera, que quedó genéricamente como la Adelita. Decía que nada más alejado de mi intención que menospreciar la contribución de esas mujeres rurales, sino mi argumento es que esa idealización de la Adelita joven, sexualmente atractiva y sumisa, es una suerte de tradición inventada a la manera de Hobsbawm, que corresponde a un estereotipo de género que cobró fuerza en los años 30 y 40. Creo que estamos ante uno de esos tropos culturales que llevó a invisibilizar a las mujeres de diversas posiciones sociales, regionales y filiaciones políticas que participaron como propagandistas, espías, mensajeras, redactoras o enfermeras en la guerra. Dentro de una lógica de género, la Adelita operó como complemento binario al revolucionario estereotípico, el macho que hablaban aquí hace rato. al revolucionario valiente de una pieza, con poder militar, político y poseedor de alguna ideología que se impuso en la memoria de la Revolución Mexicana. A diferencia de Francisco I. Madero, Emiliano Zapata, Venustiano Carranza, Francisco Villa o tantos revolucionarios locales conocidos por nombre y apellido, y desde luego por sus hazañas militares y políticas, la élite es anónima, no tiene apellido. No tiene ubicación regional ni filiación política. Puede colocarse en cualquier momento histórico, en cualquier facción. Siendo muy femenina, es adaptable a cualquier narrativa que se quiera de la Revolución Mexicana. Las mujeres son intercambiables. La Adelita y su identidad surgió como un gran tema de interés periodístico en los años 30, cuando se instauró la moda de que las jovencitas se disfrazaran de Adelita en los desfiles del 20 de noviembre. Con su acostumbrada ironía, Carlos Monsiváis, a quien recuerdo con mucho afecto, observó en uno de sus últimos trabajos: corrieron miles o decenas de miles de versiones sobre la identidad de la verdadera Adelita, y durante una etapa no había mexicano o mexicana que se respetara carente de un testimonio personal o familiar de Adelita. Era, empieza una cita de Carlos, una señora que vivía enfrente de la casa de mi mamá, o a la vuelta de la esquina. Corrió mucha tinta en periódicos, libros y folletos diversas para demostrar que Adelita, la verdadera, era de Chihuahua, Durango, Laredo o de donde ustedes quieran. Bajo esa lógica, pudo haber alguien que dijera que Adelita era en realidad de algún poblado de Michoacán o hasta de Redwood City, California. Una de las intervenciones más notables en este debate sobre la verdadera Adelita fue del secretario del Estado de Durango, Baltasar Dromundo, quien dedicó todo un libro al tema para concluir que la Adelita era la novia de todo México. Cabe destacar la copiosa intervención de escritoras, periodistas y activistas feministas, Amalia Castillo Ledón, entre muchas otras, que exaltaron las cualidades de la soldadera anónima y de la Adelita, y paradójicamente con ello contribuyeron a invisibilizar la participación de las mujeres en la Revolución Mexicana. Centrar la atención en un personaje abstracto, en una idealización de esa naturaleza, no hizo sino dejar en el olvido a los personajes históricos y en su complejidad, cuyos testimonios en gran parte se perdieron. Dos líneas de investigación independientes sobre mujeres en la Revolución Mexicana que he trabajado en los años recientes se han desenvuelto precisamente a contracorriente de la Adelita, y ello me ha permitido entender algo de las operaciones culturales de género que definen los horizontes de vida posibles para hombres y mujeres en momentos históricos de la Revolución Mexicana y del México posrevolucionario. En ambos estudios presento un análisis que relaciona las acciones de las mujeres en la etapa revolucionaria con las recreaciones de la memoria, porque creo que son inseparables. En un caso relato el cambio de identidad de género de una joven de un poblado rural que se unió a las fuerzas zapatistas ocurrió ese cambio de identidad de género mediante el uso de los recursos culturales al alcance en un pueblo rural del México de principios de siglo: el atuendo, la fotografía y la prensa. Más que el proceso de transgeneración de Amelio Robles, que siempre llama mucho la atención y provoca una recepción un tanto sensacionalista, incluso en públicos académicos, lo que me interesa enfatizar es el discurso nacionalista que hizo de Amelio Robles una coronela feminizada, representante estereotípica de esa abstracción que es la mujer revolucionaria. Esta historia está publicada en el libro Gender, Power and Politics in Modern Mexico y es un libro en proceso sobre los debates en torno a las identidades de género femenina y masculina y su relación con el nacionalismo revolucionario. Creo que este proceso está muy relacionado con la recreación de la memoria de la Revolución Mexicana. El trabajo que Robert presentó hace un rato, pues me da muchas pistas, se lo agradezco mucho y creo que puede ayudarme a fortalecer mi argumento. El otro caso que está en el libro se llamaba Elena Arizmendi, que lamentablemente no traje para la venta, pero está en Amazon. Aborda el conflicto de género y clase que llevó a Elena Arizmendi Mejía, de filiación maderista, a romper con la Cruz Blanca Neutral, asociación de socorro médico filantrópico que ella había formado. Esta asociación se creó para atender a los heridos de guerra en el norte, en los alrededores de Ciudad Juárez, que estaban abandonados a su suerte porque la Cruz Roja, la Cruz Roja mexicana, en una creación muy particular del México porfiriano, por un lado suscribía los acuerdos de 1864 de Ginebra, pero que establecían la neutralidad de esta asociación filantrópica, pero al mismo tiempo, por decreto presidencial, era una dependencia de la Secretaría de Guerra y Marina. Con esta peculiar configuración, la Cruz Roja mexicana no se mantuvo al margen del conflicto, más bien trató de minimizarlo y fue solo ante la intervención de Elena Arizmendi, que regresó a la Ciudad de México desde San Antonio, Texas, donde estudiaba enfermería, que se formó un cuerpo filantrópico. El punto que más me interesa es el conflicto que Elena Arizmendi tuvo con los propios brigadistas de la Cruz Blanca, un conflicto de clase y de género. Los jóvenes médicos voluntarios no toleraban que Elena Arizmendi fuera amiga de la familia Madero, ni tampoco su presencia mediática. Ella fue objeto de muchísimas fotografías en la frontera, incluso alguna está en una de esas hojas volantes como las que se exhiben en la exposición, y fue representada con unas cananas cruzándole el pecho. La Cruz Blanca Neutral, los integrantes, los voluntarios, la criticaron duramente porque si la asociación era neutral, ¿cómo es que posaba cruzando unas cananas al pecho? La evidencia documental, y John Mraz me corregirá si no lo ve de esta manera, muestra que en Juárez muchas mujeres mexicanas y muchas mujeres americanas se tomaban fotos de manera juguetona con cananas al pecho. Incluso un periódico de El Paso regaló unas pistolitas de juguete a todos los reporteros para conmemorar el hecho, y tenían un corchito que era la bala. Entonces, digamos como que la parte belicista del conflicto era, pues no sé, como que estaba integrado de una manera ligera. Las cosas se fueron contra Elena Arizmendi por su protagonismo como una mujer de élite, con una intervención política, voz pública y autoridad sobre los médicos. Fue así como Elena Arizmendi recurrió a la ayuda legal ya en la Ciudad de México del abogado José Vasconcelos, con quien inició una apasionada relación extramatrimonial que se volvió una de las narrativas centrales de El Ulises Criollo, el gran bestseller del siglo XX mexicano. Lo que me importa destacar de esto es que a través de la pluma de Vasconcelos, Arizmendi se convirtió en un estereotipo, el de la casa chica, el de la amante en el imaginario cultural mexicano. Las páginas que le dedicó Vasconcelos han sido descritas como la mejor muestra de literatura erótica mexicana del siglo XX. Y un colega recientemente me dijo, sí, Elena Arizmendi, la delita de lujo de José Vasconcelos. Así es que lo que quiero compartir con ustedes, sobre todo, es que la mayor dificultad al emprender proyectos de historia de género de la Revolución Mexicana han sido mis prejuicios propios y los prejuicios ajenos, que están ahí presentes todo el tiempo. El camino que he seguido es el de hacer de estos mismos prejuicios de género, de estas mismas nociones de género, como una parte central de la investigación. Muchas gracias.
Rapidísimo. Thank you very much, Gabriela, for your presentation, which fitted in very well within that time slot. Our next speaker is Margaret Chowning from the History Department at the University of California, Berkeley. It's a special pleasure to introduce Margaret, who's a distinguished historian of Mexico in the 18th and 19th century especially, although her work continues into the 20th century. She is the author of 3 important books. The first of them, 3? 2?
Just 2.
Okay, well, maybe I'm inventing something. Well,
it'd be great.
well, maybe this one you wrote in your sleep. Wealth and Power. Wealth and Power in Provincial Mexico, Michoacan, from the late colony to the Revolution. And most recently, Rebellious Nuns, The Troubled History of a Mexican Convent, 1752 to 1863. She's currently working on another book, and the working title of that book is, delicious title, Catholic Ladies and Culture Wars, Women, Politics, and the Church in Mexico, 1700 to 1940. So it's a very nice, long, satisfying time period. I just want to say that Margaret, I know, was one of the people who played a particularly important role in the planning and organization of this symposium, along with colleagues from the Spanish department and from the Bancroft, and played, I think, a particularly important role in identifying, naming, dobbing in, as we would say in Australia, the many of the speakers who are with us today. So it's great pleasure. I doy la palabra a mi amiga, Margaret.
My first talk with my new glasses. Let's see how this goes. Steve Stern, in a throwaway line toward the end of his Secret History of Gender, wrote that Mexican women have a special affinity for the church. This makes him just one of many historians who have assumed that women's relationship to religion and church is not only closer than men's relationship, but somehow timeless, perhaps even inherent in the female condition. I am convinced that Mexican women do have a special affinity for the church, but I think it is a historical relationship, time-full, not timeless. I think I can tell a compelling story about when and why it began to take shape by focusing on changes over time in how women related to ecclesiastical authority within institutions in which they played important roles: religious orders, girls' schools, and lay associations. In this paper, I'll be focusing on the pious associations, the lay associations. Making it appropriate for this conference, it is a story that I see as beginning in 1810. I began to piece it together in the diocesan archives of Michoacan and Guadalajara, and it changed when I shifted my research to Mexico City, changed again after some time in Oaxaca, and again after using the ecclesiastical archives of Durango. In other words, it's a story with regional texture. It builds off of work by several of my fellow presenters, as well as work done for Catholic Europe and the Protestant US, where the 19th century was also the century in which the church, and some would say religion as well, became feminized. Finally, although my focus is on the 19th century, it is a story with lasting political implications, as anyone following the resurgence of the church since the year 2000 will recognize. Or, as one deputy to the Congress put it in the early 1930s, 25,000 women coming before the chamber to demand the vote for women. If they obtain their objective, we shall soon have a bishop for president. Before 1810, women in lay associations were more visible than nuns, but barely. They participated in the public demonstrations of piety in which lay associations, cofradías, figured importantly, especially religious processions and fiestas, but mainly as spectators. The leaders and most active participants were men. Among the Hispanic lay associations, the Cofradías de Españoles, in the towns and cities of New Spain, women, my research has shown, actually formed a majority of the membership before 1810, but they were never the officers. In short, gender hierarchies in cofradías aligned seamlessly with gender hierarchies in colonial society, where women were also meant to be subordinate and relatively invisible. This picture began to change in 1810 with the collapse of the Mexican economy, at its heart a collapse of silver mining and lending. Without mining to create new wealth and without lending to finance recovery, since there were no banks and the church's finances, the church had been the main banker in the colonial period, the church's finances were immobilized by the inability of their debtors to repay their old debts. The post-1810 depression was prolonged well into the 1830s. Everywhere in Mexico, church institutions, including cofradías, suffered. But the suffering was especially painful in the center west of the country, where the dependence on silver had been greatest. It is there that one of the most extraordinary responses to economic hardship took place, an upending of gender hierarchies within lay associations. The cofradía's financial weakness was not the only reason for the widespread phenomenon by the 1830s of men drifting away from the cofradías. The fact of male abandonment of lay associations elsewhere in Catholic Europe and even in the United States in Protestant associations makes that clear. But for Mexico, where by the 1830s women had come to constitute huge majorities in the neighborhood of 75% of cofradia membership, I see it as the initial and most important reason. At this point, we can begin to detect the regional variation I referred to earlier. As the economy slowly recovered in Mexico City, in Oaxaca, in Durango, most colonial-era cofradias stabilized. That is, there remained large female majorities, but men continued to lead them, as they had in the colonial period. The story was different in the center-west, however. In the states of Michoacán, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Zacatecas, Aguascalientes, many of the old male-led confraternities had become almost totally dysfunctional. It was here that a new model of lay association emerged, one that not only permitted but required female leadership, even in mixed-gender associations, or what one priest called the very improper and very inconvenient spectacle of women governing men. The revolution in gender relations began in San Miguel de Allende, where the parish priest had first tried and failed to revive many of the old confraternities. In April 1840, 32 ladies in San Miguel delivered a letter to their parish priest proposing the foundation of a new devotional association dedicated to the perpetual vigil over the Blessed Sacrament. Its lengthy name shortened to the Vela Perpetua. 31 señoras would be given the name of Cabeza del Día. Each cabeza would be responsible for signing up 2 people to sit vigil for every half hour of the day, beginning at 6 in the morning and continuing until 6 at night. Each cabeza had responsibility for 1 day of the month. The cabezas would elect an hermana mayor and a treasurer. Later, most velas added a secretary, all to be women. Men could join, but by constitutional rule, women were to be the officers. When the petition from San Miguel reached the offices of the bishop, no one knew quite what to do. The first to see the petition was the bishop's chief legal advisor, the promotor fiscal, who cautiously and rather tepidly applauded the foundation before sending the petition on to the bishop. Ordinarily, the bishop would then have approved the recommendation of his promotor, but breaking with normal practice, he asked another legal advisor, his provisor, to have a look at it. This advisor was clearly nervous about approving it, so invoking the usually ignored provision that civil authorities must approve new foundations of pious associations, he required the ladies of San Miguel to resubmit their request, this time to the governor of the Department of Guanajuato. They did so. The governor appointed a special departmental junta to discuss the case. If the bishop's advisors, however, had hoped that the civil authorities would bail them out of making a decision on the female-led vela, they were disappointed. The departmental junta evaluated the vela petition positively, since, as they said, individuals who inspire our confidence, the priest and the prefect, had approved of it, since the vela did not mix the spiritual with the political or civil, and since it did not threaten to disturb the peace. This complicated set of delays and confusion on the part of the church hierarchy confirms the obvious, that the vela was different from anything that had come before. But once it was approved, the San Miguel vela took on a new life as a precedent for the future. The vela perpetua spread quickly through the states of Michoacán and Guanajuato, moving from town to town in a way that you can almost plot out on a map. By 1843, it had reached the state of Jalisco, where there was another explosion of interest. By 1850, at least 50 velas had been founded in the diocese of Michoacán and Guadalajara, an average of almost 6 a year, and by 1860, there were at least 82 in existence in those two dioceses. This was during a period when other new foundations of pious associations were extremely rare. There was simply no precedent in the history of Mexican cofradías for the enthusiasm with which the velas were received in these two bishoprics, or the rapidity with which they proliferated. About 25% of the membership of the new associations was male, about what the balance between men and women had been in the old colonial confraternities. It is striking how easily the men who became members of the Vela Perpetua appear to have accepted female leadership. But the same cannot always be said of the relationship with priests. Although priests benefited in a number of ways from the presence of the Vela Perpetua in their parish, they were not always happy to have such a popular, female-led organization to contend with. This is because the generally elite and middle-class women of the Vela understood how power worked and used that knowledge to defend their organization, a set of skills that proved especially important as the Velas began to raise significant sums of money. The more the Velas' funds grew, the more priests were tempted to try to dictate their use. Rafael Herrera, for example, the parish priest of San Diego del Bizcocho in Guanajuato, asked the Vela to pay some of his expenses in light of the fact that it had accumulated so much money. The ladies responded that their treasury is not his personal store, and accused him of abusing power and of interfering in their elections. Though after several exchanges he responded that he desired to put an end to disputes with women, he could not resist remarking that if he had in fact interfered in the last elections, quote, Doña Florentina Garate would never have been elected Hermana Mayor. In 1850, the priest of Jaral, also in Guanajuato, José de Jesus Robledo, was locked in a similar battle with the Hermana Mayor of that Vela. The administration of this institution, he fulminated, has passed from the hands of the priest to the hands of a woman, one who functions as an arbiter of and superior to the priest. She is the one who ordains and disposes whatever she judges to be convenient to the Vela. She has bought some items for the cult, but these are only to be used when she disposes, or if I beg and plead, so that the host is subject to the will of the señora. I have reproached her for her absolutism, telling her that she has been put in charge of the veladoras, but she has not been put in charge of the church. In another case involving the ladies of the Pátzcuaro Vela, the socially prominent Hermana Mayor, Doña María de la Luz Sierra, and most of the cabezas and other officers threatened to resign over the issue of who controlled the funds of the Vela. Doña Luz argued her case in a lengthy and well-crafted letter to the priest, Victoriano Treviño. The Vela, she wrote, had been so successful that it was able not only to cover its costs, but also to undertake the ambitious work of rebuilding the church, rescuing it from its miserable and abandoned state and transforming it into the beautiful building we see today. But now Treviño wanted to dictate which projects the Vela would pay for. He demanded that instead of paying for the roof of the sacristy, the Vela should finance repairs on the roof of the baptistery. As the ladies saw it, the sacristy roof repair prevented the ruination of a large part of the wall of the church, whereas the baptistery roof repair, besides being much more expensive, quote, only serves to protect a hallway that is of little use other than as a place for you to drink your chocolate and distract your imagination with agreeable vistas. Beyond this specific issue, Doña Luz wrote, Treviño had offended the women of the Vela by calling them impertinent old women. Quote, I do not consider myself capable of maintaining good harmony with you, she continued, and so I have decided to resign my task of leading the Vela. Others joined her, and the priest had to back down. In all three of these cases, priests' disgust with the Vela officers' unwillingness to be submissive was expressed in obviously gendered language. Herrera's dispute of dismissal of disputes with women, Robledo's calling the Hermana Mayor an absolutist, Trevina's angry lashing out at impertinent old women, suggesting that the expectation of feminine docility and the ability at long last to control lay associations with these docile women was a part of the initial priestly enthusiasm for the Vela. Their attitude toward defiant, educated women in leadership positions is certainly not shocking. In my research on a convent rebellion in the 1760s, the epithets directed against the leader of the dissident faction, she was called a caudillo and a despot, were similar to those used by priests against the Vela ladies. But female leadership in the Vela Perpetua and in the other female-led pious associations that followed opened up a much broader terrain on which those strained relationships between priests and relatively powerful women played out than the cloistered world of the convent. Furthermore, whereas convent rebellion was a transgression that was put down in such a way as ultimately to reinforce the very gender hierarchy it had challenged, female leadership of the Vela Perpetua was accepted, if grudgingly, by a church that needed to make important adjustments in order to survive in a treacherous political climate. Far from reinforcing old hierarchies, it permanently opened up new spaces for women in the church. I want for the remainder of this paper to consider the political implications of the gender challenge implicit in the Vela Perpetua. The Vela was not outwardly political. It did not even hold meetings until much later in the century. It was not a coffee house or a tavern where politics were discussed. But I argue, building on the work of students of civil society who point out that even non-political organizations have political implications, my favorite example being Robert Putnam's bowling leagues, that there are 4 ways that the Vela was political and that understanding it can help us better understand Mexican politics. Indeed, that failing to understand the relationship between women and the church will prevent us from fully understanding Mexican politics. First and most obvious, the Vela gave the mid-century clergy in the center-west a way to reconnect the laity to the church by means of novel, attractive, extra-liturgical ties. This was a show of power that impressed and reassured and emboldened Catholic men, and it surely contributed to the change in liberal depictions of the relationship between the church and women. From the relatively benign associations of the early 19th century, when liberals gently relegated religion to a private sphere to which they had also assigned women, by calling women the natural guardians of Christian values, religion was now depicted as the business of fanatical beatas, vulgar old women, and the church as hiding behind the petticoats of its female supporters. The very fact that liberals hoped to denigrate the church by caricaturing its relationship to women strongly suggests that relationships like those forged in the foundation of the Vela Perpetua gave the church some of the power that the liberals hoped to undermine. Second, the Vela offered a way to appeal to and attract liberal Catholics and even religious liberals. When the Velas privileged private meditations in front of the Blessed Sacrament over participation in street processions, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, over the communal relationship with fellow processants, individual responsibility for organizing and keeping to an assigned schedule over once-a-year displays of passion, the interior over the exterior, the individual over the communal, the quiet over the exuberant, the rational over the emotional, they unselfconsciously embodied the kind of modern religious culture which modern Catholics, liberal Catholics, could embrace. The third way was more direct. By organizing elite and middle-class women under female leadership, the Vela and other female-led religious associations made it easier for women to petition, protest, and demonstrate as women. The first major entry into politics of women self-identified as women came as part of the 1850s and 1860s protests against the laws of the Reform and other anti-clerical measures. For the first time that I know of, numerous petitions came from the señoras of X town or city. Among my still incomplete sample of female protest, women's groups in the center-west seem to have been disproportionately represented. over 600 women from Guadalajara, over 500 from Morelia, and hundreds of women from dozens of other small towns in Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Michoacán signed multiple petitions. It is impossible to connect the success of the Vela in the Center-West to the high degree of activism of Catholic women in that region in other than a correlative way, but even the point of a correlation is worth making. Finally, in a similar vein, several historians, attempting to discover what distinguished the regions of Mexico where the late 1920s Cristero rebellion flourished from other parts of Mexico where it did not, have concluded that the presence or absence of a vibrant Catholic associational life was an important factor. This raises the question, largely unaddressed in the literature on the Cristeros, of how that especially active associational life came into existence. Devotional associations had proliferated throughout Mexico beginning in the 1890s, a part of the Vatican-inspired devotional revolution in defense of global Catholicism. But my research suggests that in the Center-West, the long history of women's leadership of pious associations was clearly important in producing a dense landscape of religious associationalism with deep historical roots where the Cristero movement could flourish. In sum, a key date in the history of the relationship between women, the Catholic Church, and Mexican politics is 1810, which set in motion a chain of events that led to the establishment of pious associations led by women that in turn helped the Church survive at the grassroots level during the dark days from the Reform to around 1880 or 1890 or so, when the coast was cleared by Porfirio Diaz and his policy of reconciliation with the Church. That the Diaz regime shows the path of reconciliation may even be seen as a reflection of the Church's ability to adjust, to accept the unacceptable idea of women as leaders and women governing men, to reinvent itself, and by means of that reinvention to maintain a powerful presence in people's lives. The Vela Perpetua was a key part of that process. Moreover, the institutions for which it paved the way, like the Damas Católicas, continue to help the Church retain the political power that it seems, yet once again, to have recovered since the 2000 elections. Interestingly, as Eddie found in Oaxaca and Matthew Butler in eastern Michoacán, and as Luis González made clear a long time ago for San Jose de Gracia, 1910 was not as significant a date as 1810. The revolution obviously mattered in people's lives in important ways, but it did not bring about major changes in the clerical alliance with women, the special relationship to women that had been forged in the 1840s.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret. And our third and final speaker in this session is Edward Wright-Rios from Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And he's going to be speaking to us on fitting Fanáticas, nation, narration, and assimilation of pious femininity in revolutionary Mexico. Edward is a cultural historian who's been working on late 19th and early 20th century Mexico. He also has a regional dimension to his work. His book, Revolution in Modern Catholicism, Reform and Revelation. I keep on saying Reform and Revolution. Reform and Revelation in Oaxaca, 1887 to 1934, is a prize-winning text. I think it's won 2 prizes already, including most recently the prize given to the best Mexico book in the social sciences, awarded by the Mexico section of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA. And I have had the honor of being part of that committee, and so it's a pleasure to see the face behind the book. So over to you, Edward.
Science, which I'm not going to talk about. While this is coming back up, I just want to again thank everybody, Margaret, Barry, Berkeley, all my colegas who made the trip out here, all of the público who was also here, and of course, Liz, who made the arrangements possible, especially that documento at the Bancroft I was able to look at today. As you guys are going to see in this paper, I've taken the opportunity to try to experiment a little bit today. And I think I'm going to need to buy a drink for John and a drink for Robert later to talk about some of this, my ideas with you. Okay, so let me launch. In 1917, a new newspaper emerged in Mexico City called La Madre Matiana, a satirical newspaper promising a mystical, truth-telling parody of politics and society. Here you can see the 1927 Primera Época, and here 1923 example of the Segunda Época. Of course, like any good new satirical paper, it issued a manifesto. Madre Matiana was a legendary Mexican prophetess who had come back to watch over the nation and tell truths. She feared no one. She'd seen death. She was going to see all and tell all. She was going to target corruption, ineptitude, arrogance, and social deviance. Some years later, in 1935, photographer Lola Alvarez Bravo produced an image, which I'll show you later, titled La Madre Matiana. In this image, a homely, conservatively dressed female figure, in fact, a mannequin, a fake woman, appears in a crowded public setting surrounded by men. Now, oh, there it is. I didn't take it out. So there you can see La Madre Matiana, 1935, by Lola Alvarez Bravo. In 1962, Agustín Yáñez published his book called Las Tierras Flacas. This book is an allegorical, rural story of social groups and characters, all symbolically loaded. And, as Agustín Yáñez liked to do, he set it on the eve of revolution. The pivotal figure in this text is an aged yet vigorous faith healer and mystic named Madre Matiana. She serves as the social conscience, the repository of history and arcane devotional practices, the voice of social solidarity and justice, and, of course, there's a looming epical clash. Difficult challenges are in the offing, and this is clear from the very beginning. Can Agustín Yáñez's place that he calls Tierra Santa, it's Mexico and Chiquito, and its people be transformed? Can the suffering emblematic family in the story be saved? And how can a new political order and modern ideas be harmonized with the heartfelt, profoundly Mexican, but wrong-headed popular culture epitomized by the character Madre Matiana? So who was this Madre Matiana, and why does she keep appearing in 20th century social commentary? Well, the first appearance of Madre Matiana is in calendarios and almanaques from the late 1850s. It's really, in the beginning, a Reform-era story of late colonial visions, although probably completely fictitious. A humble servant in one of Mexico's convents foresees Mexico's calamitous 19th century before the nation existed. The story goes, Mexico's impieties would invite this divine punishment. Blame is assigned for Mexico's trouble. Modern error gendered masculine. Instability, disorder, strife, foreign invasion, foreign cultural influences, poverty, debt, and lackluster economic growth. It was a call for collective expiation, although the term they use is desagravio, which I don't know how you translate into English. Unangering. Devout women in this text are destined to catalyze a restoration of Catholic order and save the nation. What I'm working on right now is a book that looks at a century of reinterpretations of this text, essentially, and this prophetic tradition, and this character. Some devout, some scornful, and other, I would say, anxious. Matiana and the prophecies, then, became lodged in Mexican folklore, with periodic moments of renewed salience, coinciding usually with intense cultural and social conflicts. We see here in almanacs, pamphlets, cartoons, newspapers, broadsides, books, and official church publications bring her up. I see Matiana as this window on this cultural history, this time from the 1850s to more or less the 1960s. I'm trying to analyze the prophecies, a representation of them, an appropriation of the female visionary persona over a century. Today, I'm only going to talk about the 20th century, though, and explore how thinking and talking about female piety, fanaticism, and, crucially, playing the part of the fanatica served as a means of representing, pondering, controlling, constructing nation, gender, and popular culture. So my argument is here. In the 20th century, appropriations and performances of Madre Matiana, in them we have exercises of Mexican memory making and reformist performance. These amount to trying to fit a symbolic fanatica in the modern nation and using her to explore or establish the boundaries of national identity and social norms. Efforts here are to find a place for devout femininity and, by association and conflation, popular culture, often especially religious culture, that is gendered female in 20th century nationalism. Madre Matiana functions then in these texts as a muse and conundrum. Matiana is a representative of popular culture's stubborn, quote, superstitious nature. However, Matiana is also a symbol of authenticity and hence conjures this paradox. In some ways, it's akin to the indigenismo we heard about earlier today. I'm thinking that in these texts, building the nation as it required incorporating the Indian in some way also means a need to assimilate, control, transform the representation of pious femininity and its alleged quintessentially Mexican culture that it often stood for. Okay, so this newspaper, the revolutionary context. It comes out in 1917, and I subtitle my analysis of this, Satire, Derision and Recognition. Madre Matiana's revolutionary renaissance, when you have violence, when you have poverty, anti-clericalism, it fits the doom and gloom story of the original prophecies. And here we see a broadside from 1914. Here you can see La Celebre Madre Matiana. And essentially this broadside with a posada, fin del mundo, here, it's basically saying, is it possible that the end that Matiana predicted, it's really this revolution? New publications emerge during the revolution. Additional prophecies are invented and stuck into new versions. Madre Matiana emerges also as a symbol of anti-revolutionary anger in the exile press. So La Revista Mexicana in 1916, San Antonio, Texas, uses Matiana as grist, as this tool for taunts and pleas. They used this prophecy that had been added, that the people would drag a presidente barbudo por las calles to taunt Carranza. They would say things like, ya viene la Madre Matiana por ti. Mejor afeítate, Don Venus. Things like that. Or also pleas. They would say, Matiana, they would write, carta abierta a Madre Matiana. Please, Matiana, make your prophecies come true and get rid of this revolutionary trash. Now, this paper celebrated the publication of La Madre. La Madre is how they like to call themselves, the editors. Now, this is a guy named Ángel Prieto. If anybody knows how I can find out more about Ángel Prieto, the editor and director, here we see the masthead from 1917 blown up and the one from 1928, and there's some key differences that I'll talk about. The structure of 1917 paper, it's a parody, really, of the Calendario devotional literature. Its content is kind of wacky. It's doom and gloom language. We have the composite female namesake sort of hero figure. In part, she's the 19th century pamphlet prophetess with the revolutionary twist. Instinctively, she knows the future of the nation, but she's crazy. She has these oddly accurate predictions, this stereotyping of female discernment. She says nonsense that's making fun of Mexican superstitious tendencies. There's a sort of así somos vibe to this paper. And yet, often, she's strangely accurate. At the same time, she's the classic figure, the beatona or fanática del pueblo, the paradigmatic Mexican figure, aggressively irrational, but sometimes saying things that are discomfitingly true. Here we see this extreme gendering of fanaticism, And also, as you can see in this picture, she is the marimacha vengadora, a popular sort of figure of vengeance. Here on the masthead, we see her with this, we could say, phallic sword, if you want. She's skewering a priest right here, and she appears to penetrate another over here. While little murciélagos, we could call them vampiros políticos if you want, are flying away, and the serpent of deception is also on its way, leaving Matiana. What I see happening in this paper is the marking of the limits of propriety through satire. If we want to talk about this more later, I would love to talk to you more about my analysis of this, where they very cleverly in one piece talk about what in Mexico, lo que tiene madre y lo que no tiene madre. So often in this, I see what I would call a staging of desmadre in this performance. By 1923, though, in this, there's a taming of La Madre Matiana. And the image here, the image change says it all. No longer is she the vengadora marimacha with the sword, but she's back to being the beata, sweeping. She's sweeping, she's got a rosario here. She's right in front of the Cámara de Diputados, so she's in this key place. You see these famous políticos are being swept up. And there's this vague pro-worker industrialization stance and a conservative turn. Criticism of emergent feminism and agrarismo. Cultural complaints, this is where I was thinking of Robert's paper, about los fifis, a sort of disgust for urban bourgeois masculinity. There's also an interesting switch away from the prophetess voice of parody to a vulgar, masculine-voiced bravado. More sarcasm now than parody. And here we see an identifying of lo mexicano con lo vulgar y alburero. I found a text where Carlos Monsiváis actually mentions La Madre Matiana as the beginning of what he sees as a collective enjoyment of the lewd as a notion of lo mexicano, as a unique Mexican quality of inventiveness when it comes to crass discussions of excrement, sex acts, and sex parts. And you start to see this in the headlines. So, for example, you see a headline that says, and I have to say it this way, right? Con esa lengua que tienen, hacen sabio a mi pelón. Things like this, and others that are absolutely, completely vulgar. That one roughly translates, if I have to, with that tongue, or nonsense, I would say, that they have, they make my baldy seem genius. Now, Lola Alvarez Bravo, and the depiction of female piety. Here I'm referring to it, subtitling it as Irony and Demystification. Lola Alvarez Bravo, a participant in Mexico's nationalist art movement, photography director of El Maestro Rural in the 1930s, a famous portraitist. But I need to know more about her, so if you can help me with this, I would love to talk to you later. Here I see a subtle humor and visual satire. Often she treats religiosity, and she seems to be pulling back the curtain. Pious women appear in a sort of poses of futility, sometimes with masculine indifference. Masculinity in religious settings is farcical or often masked. In this case, we see these santos with the title La Última Cena, Pocos son los escogidos, also from 1935. And they're supposedly in some conversation, but of course, they're made of wood. They can't talk to each other. This religion is man-made. Madre Matiana, 1935, we see the Beata out of place. She's the mojigata. Look how she's dressed. The sanctimonious prude, but she's in the public sphere. An empty, lifeless, voiceless conservative character. The faux female in a sea of modern masculinity. But she's the center of the photograph. She's almost attended by these men, but we don't know their purposes or intentions. One seems to read to her, one seems to gesture to the one in front of her, who seems to be fiddling with these devotional objects in front. But there's this symbolic youth who stares right past her and engages the viewer and essentially says, this is a photograph. I see you, photographer, and I think maybe I see you, female photographer, might be what's happening there. Now, Agustín Yáñez. Here I see what I would call a memoria, or a lamento. The famed author, politician, presidential speechwriter, incredibly well-connected individual, whose famous book, Al filo del agua, is sometimes cited as an accurate depiction of religious culture on the eve of revolution, which I find sort of amazing. I got 10. But his book, very famously, he has that line that you see represented here. It's about, on the eve of revolution, un pueblo de mujeres enlutadas. Yáñez was preoccupied with religious culture and the transformative notion of the religion. This is a very optimistic book. It really suggests that Catholicism, the root of Mexico's explosion in 1910, was the pent-up tension among women due to Catholicism's straitjacketing. But it's optimistic. The revolution comes, enlightenment arrives, the characters have these self-realizations, individuals seize control of their own destiny and Mexico's. But Las Tierras Flacas of 1962 is very different. We had this chance, the text seemed to say, to remake Mexico, and we failed. This is an autocrítica. The revolution missed reformist opportunity. There was a lack of will, focus, or sustained diligence. Tierra Santa, his allegorical place, is beset by this villainous cacique and his sons, a dysfunctional patriarchy. Everything pure and good is in danger, femininity and ideals. But his Matiana sustains the community as best she can, and she's been doing it for ages. She's far older than anyone else. She's the moral steward of the valley. She heals. She's the reader of souls. We have this family melodrama also taking place. Rómulo, the padre de familia, is a peasant who loves the land and has some notion of liberal ideas, but cannot get himself to act, to defend it, or to cause change. His wife, Mercedes, la madre de familia, she's devout. She's the symbol of popular female frustration. Sick of suffering, sick of mortifications, unfulfilled in her marriage. She wants justice, and she's mad at Rómulo for not being forward. Often behind them is the notion of their dead, pure daughter, Teófila. All the names are symbolic, right? This is the dead daughter backstory. She was devout within reason. She was a quick study catechist. Educated, she becomes a teacher, a socially useful occupation. She introduces the sewing machine, and she's incredibly skilled in its use. Yáñez has this passage, a sort of awe-inspiring fusion of the young female form and labor-saving modern machinery. But she dies mysteriously as the cacique tries to add her to his harem. There's this extreme depiction of female fanaticism in Teófila's difficult birth story. Of course, news of the birth inspires a convergence of viejas, with remedios, disgusting poultices, concoctions, baths, candles, scores of images, and Matiana is the mistress of ceremonies in a home that is this symbolically dark place of female superstition. Chile smoke is bellowing, saints are everywhere, poor Mercedes is draped in relics. She has to kiss different images and smell different herbs at different times. Matiana kicks out Rómulo at one time of his own house because he doesn't like the way things are going. She blames him for the difficult birth, and then she hangs Mercedes from a beam and yanks the baby out with a belt. There's signs of impending change, though. Madre Matiana senses this problem. There's a whole chapter that is sort of her internal thinking. She's tired. It tells about her past. She's born in 1848, very important date, when Mexico has its great calamity. She stands at the allegorical nation's border of past and present and future. She's the linchpin, though, of solidarity. But she's overwhelmed and she's tiring. And then the cacique's prodigal son returns. He had left the valley and he comes back a new Mexicano, and he announces himself at the pastorelas, where he puts on an extravagant staging of the epic battle between Luzbel and San Miguel. Everybody witnesses it, and everybody is awed. And what he uses as special effects is electricity. And later he explains to everyone how electricity works, and the cacique's spell is broken. Then it's this huge, long build-up to this explosive moment. Matiana, though, does not fit in this new Mexico that is coming. In the last violent struggle by the goons of old order, they ambush Madre Matiana, who had thrown her lot in with this character, Jacobo, and they gouge out her eyes, which dangle from their bloody sockets. And the visionary, the mystic, is left sightless and bitter. The forces of new order triumph, but then they lose interest.
Madre Matiana, the symbol of tradition, is dispatched. Maimed but not killed, she disappears into the darkness of her house. Electricity arrives, but no concerted effort is made to implant truly emancipating ideas or practices. And a new devotion emerges to Teofila's sewing machine. Fanaticism endures in new guises. Yanez says, essentially, we have failed to truly transform Mexico. Modernization has taken place. Ay Dios. The revolution failed to reform popular culture with sensitivity, and Mexico's modernization is disjointed and ill-fitting. Now, how do I analyze this? Let me just say two sort of tools that I've been using. In part, Nita Yuval Davis's work on the representation of women in national discourse and in identity narratives. This notion of women's use as symbolic boundary markers, as embodying the nation, and positioned very carefully in narratives to show these boundaries and to have them at least rhetorically transgressed or maintained. They mark these limits between us and them, lo nuestro, lo legítimo, or lo ilegítimo. They are symbolic border guards. They carry the burden of representation, as she says. So we can see this in the satirical paper. Matiana embodies the line between lo mexicano and lo corrupto. Part of their humor is that she's often more rational and more Mexican than the targets of derision, usually políticos. She's a character that delineates and transgresses rationality, language, gender again. Here we have the nutty mystica in the public sphere. In Lola Alvarez Bravo, her compositional placement of devout femininity makes the images work and creates that satirical paradox. In Agustin Yanez, Matiana is the book's central symbolic plot device. Her marginalization brings this transition to the ill-fitting modernity. I'm also drawing on Jill Lane's work on black-faced theater in Cuba. I know it doesn't sound like a fit, but I think it does. She really talks about this satirical use of characters of the racial other. And they're ridiculed, but at the same time, they're a tool for assimilating blackness. The mulata, the bozal, and my favorite, and the one I think is most like Madre Matiana, is el negrito catedrático, the one who makes a mess of everything. In a sense, I see Matiana in this context as a sort of reactionary Cantinflas femenina. So there's this mocking yet depicting of these characters as uniquely Mexican. Impersonation there in her work creates a space where this new nationalism, this new way of being can be invented, shared, and practiced. And something similar is happening with Matiana's repeated appropriation and representation in Mexico. I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, we have a good solid 19 minutes for comments and discussion. So as we did this morning, hands up and just give your name and say who your question is directed to. It could be either in English or Spanish, of course. Yep. Would you like to? I think there's a microphone for people to use here.
You have to get on your cell phone. I'm Rosario Alberra at UC Berkeley School of Public Health, and I want to congratulate the whole panel and the previous panelists because of the fresh look of the Mexican Revolution. It's hard to hear that kind of reflection, especially here in the US. My question will be for Gabriela Cano. Me encantó el análisis que hizo usted y sobre todo que su preocupación fundamental al hacer este estudio fue combatir sus propios prejuicios, pero dado que el objeto de investigación es anónimo, yo supondría que el mayor obstáculo para hacer estas conclusiones pues está en encontrar la bibliografía, ¿verdad? Entonces no sé a qué fuentes nos pudiera referir para alimentarnos sobre este tema.
Creo que el resumen que hice fue demasiado apretado como para entrar en muchos de los detalles. En realidad yo he trabajado sobre personajes que ya no son anónimos y por más que sí la evidencia es muy escasa y siempre hay que leer así como pedacitos, fragmentos de información, tanto para la historia de Amelio Robles como para la historia de Elena Arizmendi, que son casos límites, pues resultó que sí había suficientes fuentes para armar un relato, no las podría yo detallar en este momento. A lo que me refería era con los prejuicios propios y ajenos, es que muchas veces las fuentes pues estaban ahí, pero yo pues no las entendía francamente. Voy a poner un ejemplo muy breve. En el caso de la historia de este personaje que yo describo como transgénero, uno de mis primeros trabajos publicados fue sobre Amelia Robles, vista como una mujer revolucionaria ejemplar, porque en su localidad existe un discurso conmemorativo local que a una persona que desde todos puntos de vista tiene un aspecto y actúa como hombre, se convirtió en símbolo de la mujer revolucionaria. Y yo misma en 1988 escribí Amelia Robles, la mujer revolucionaria. Después de eso hice algunas lecturas sobre performance de género y identidades diversas de la sexualidad, y fue como pude entender a este personaje. Voy a hablar sobre esta otra historia el lunes en Stanford.
Further comments? Yes.
My name's Matthew Butler. I have a question for Margaret Chowning. I really enjoyed your paper. I thought it's a fascinating way to look at the kind of ideological geography of Mexico in the 19th century, and it's really going to help us understand how those parts of the country like Michoacán and Jalisco that had liberal prelates in the late colonial period end up being the bastions of Orthodox Catholicism in Mexico. My question is really, the first one is the kind of chicken and egg question. Why does it occur in particular those places in the first place? If that's the consequence, why does it start there rather than in Puebla or Oaxaca or anywhere else? And the second question is, how does it spread? And especially in terms of the role of the clergy in all of this, do they run with this and push this in some way? Otherwise you end up with the paradox of a religion which empowers women, ultimately reinforcing a very patriarchal, bishop-dominated church henceforth.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about some parts of this paper that I cut out in order to stay within my 20 minutes. I'm going to start with the sort of second part of the question. First, the regional dimensions of this, I have to confess, are still giving me some trouble. I started out in Michoacán, which is a great diocesan archive, and the nature of the nationalization of that archive has meant an unusual degree of preservation of material. So I started there, and poking around in the boxes on pious associations, I just kept coming across the Vela Perpetua, this and that. It just hadn't heard of it, but no kind of breakthrough document. I was looking in the boxes on parishes when I found the San Miguel Foundation that really made it clear that this was something new and something sort of worth pursuing. And so I did pursue it. I was doing research on other stuff too, but I was especially interested in pursuing the Vela Perpetua in other parts of Mexico. As it happened, I first went to Guadalajara, where, as I described in this paper, the same thing happens. I mean, it arrives, and it's like, must be some kind of word of mouth because of the geographical spacing of the foundations. You get, a cluster from San Miguel. It spreads to, I'm not going to name all the little towns that spread to from there, but I mean, you can map it. So by this time, I'm thinking this is a national phenomenon, right? Because I found it in the first place I looked. I found it in the second place I looked. So I went to Mexico City thinking it probably was first in Mexico City. I'm adopting that kind of, everything happens first in Mexico City bias. And nothing. There was one Vela Perpetua founded in the Sagrario in Mexico City in 1848, and the woman who founded it said, I'm copying the Constitution from Guanajuato, which was a copy of the Constitution from San Miguel. And as far as I know, it survived, but there was no other foundation there. There's no indication that anywhere before. One little foundation in 1855 in, I forget, somewhere in the archbishopric, really not very much interest. Then I went to Oaxaca, and again, a sort of 1856 foundation there, but not in very many places, not very much interest. I've looked through the Puebla, the Mormon records from Puebla. I haven't found a single Vela Perpetua there. I haven't looked everywhere. In Durango, the same thing. There was a kind of isolated foundations, but not this kind of mania for the Vela Perpetua that you get in Michoacán and Guadalajara. So obviously there's something going on. And the explanation that I kind of short-shrifted in this paper, just to make this a little bit quicker, I'm sorry I'm talking too much, builds on the idea that this is a pretty revolutionary thing, that men have to approve of it, the male leaders of other confraternities. Priests have to approve of it. There has to be a need for it. There has to be kind of a perfect storm in order for something like this to be accepted with enthusiasm by the community, by the pious community, and by the priests. And for me, that explanation has to do with the nature of the economic collapse in the parts of Mexico that depended on silver mining. I mean, and that's what I'm working with so far. That seems to me to answer the question of why men were apathetic about it, and to answer the question of why priests did something that they really probably didn't want to do, which is accept this upending of the way things are supposed to be done. So it's kind of an economic or financial, I guess, explanation that is the one that's the one I'm working with. I'm working with now. Okay, I'm gonna not answer your other question about where it gets started because we need to save some time for other people.
Gabby, a couple comments and a question. One is it was fascinating to hear this whole question of the Adelitas and how that floats and how it's anonymous. And I'm going to really look forward to seeing your paper written. I don't think that there's any photographic researcher in Mexico that hasn't come across una viejita. In some part of Mexico, all over Mexico, there are viejitas who say that they are the Adelita, and they show the picture, there it is up on the wall, and they say, and there it is, there's the evidence. You can see that I'm the Adelita. And the second comment is I think you're absolutely right about the development of that iconographical type of the women with the crossed cananas, and I think you do a fine job of that in your book on Arismendi. And the other question that comes to me from photography is, do you know if there's any relation between Amelio Robles, and Carmen Robles, the photographed Zapatista Coronela?
Thank you very much, John, for your two questions, because I can go and talk about my work with that. About the picture with the woman of the cananas, actually it was an engraving that I include in the book, and recently somebody wrote to me offering to sell the broadsheet, the original broadsheet where that engraving comes from, and it includes the photograph, the original photograph. So next edition, I will include it. Well, if actually the offers stay, and if they don't send an email saying now it's double or triple the price, I'll see. About Carmen Robles is the same person. Her name is Carmen Amelia Robles. I found both the birth certificates, the original one in the Libro de Actas of her town, and it's La Niña Carmen Amelia Robles. The Historia Gráfica de la Revolución Mexicana only leaves the Carmen Robles, but it's the complete name. And of course, I also found the birth certificate that Robles made to order to fit his sense of masculinity that was made probably in the early 50s, and he only writes Amelio. But it's the same person.
We'll have to talk about it later because I think it's not, because I found another picture of her. I found another picture of her where, from the Fototeca, where she's identified as La Negra Angustias.
Yes.
She's very clearly a different person.
Okay.
She's very black.
No. Thanks again
But we'll talk about it later.
for that question, but no, yes, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, over dinner conversation here, Claudio.
Claudio Lamnitz. I have a question for Margaret. I thought that the paper was really fascinating, and but I have a question about the broader framing, because it sounded at the beginning that your question really had to do with female religiosity, and when you said that what you were performing and achieving in this research was to make this problem time full rather than timeless, I it was right on what you did. At the same time, I had the sense that the story you were telling was really not exclusively or even that much necessarily about women's piety as it was about really the gendered history of the public sphere. I mean, and because the history of women's piety would just need a different, I don't know, both a different kind of a temporal and a spatial framing, so far as you have, such a deep history of this. There's been, various histories of the Marian cult, the ways in which the space of the church is gendered, the ways in which the space of the house is are gendered, all of those kinds of things, which have let's say, a different historicity than the problem of the Republic and the gendered connection between the church and the public sphere, which I thought was what your paper was. So I wanted to hear whether this interpretation is correct. And then just a brief one for Edward. I thought it was fascinating stuff, but I would like to hear, if you could, a very brief enunciation of really what is the question? That is, what is Mexico's disjointed modernity? I didn't quite catch it, so I could use a reiteration.
Shall I? The Steve Stern quote, unless I've misquoted him, is Mexican women have a special affinity for the church, which I read as for the church, its cluster of institutions, the priests that are part of the church, and not a special affinity for religion. So I don't actually think that I am all that interested in female piety. I mean, I'm not uninterested in it, but that's not what I think I am, you're absolutely right. It's this sort of social history of church institutions, and I'm trying to make this a story that has a connection to a political story or to the gendered history of the public sphere is another way of. I mean, it's amounts to the same thing. So, I guess if I were pushed on this, I might have to say that there is a certain, despite what I've said, a certain assumption of timelessness where female piety is concerned, even though I'm not really studying it, because what my story is showing is all those cofradia membership lists that I went through for the colonial period that showed large numbers of women in the colonial cofradias it's almost like their female piety is there, and the institutional connection to the church, and it's waiting for its space to open in this readjustment of the public sphere that happens around 1810. So I don't want to make an economic interpretation of the entire cluster of changes in women's relationship to the church. I think where the economic argument helps me is in explaining the regional dimension of it, rather than the bigger story has a story about the public sphere that I'm just didn't talk about today. But thank you. Thanks. Excellent. Oh, you've got yours.
We'll have, unfortunately, because of time, we'll have to finish with Edward's response to it.
Okay.
My fault.
My issue here with, or this saying, this is non, is it? Disjointed modernity comes from my reading of Agustín Yáñez. And what he presents there is this idea that La Revolución is supposed to bring modernity, modern technologies, irrigation, and the book is full of these things that it's supposed to bring, new ideas and practices. Yet his autocrítica of La Revolución, I think, and his own participation in it, is that we didn't complete it. We didn't do it right. And what's left is this, we still have this backward popular culture of which Madre Matiana is the symbol. And then when I think of him sort of struggling with what is it that remains out of sync with this new way of being, it's esa gente, and it's esas viejas especially, or symbolically. And then I see this, and this has made me think about the photographer in 1935 and the satirical newspapermen in 1917 and 1923, is why appropriate this figure who's considered a bad sort of symbol of lo fanático, or that we need to get rid of. And yet, because our population, lo mexicano, still seems so caught there, they keep going back to it and portraying it, replaying it, appropriating it, mocking it, but in an attempt to assimilate it, is my notion, is that it's disjointed because we cannot or haven't yet assimilated this popular culture, which we gender female in its fanaticism.
Well, thank you, and really interesting panel. Unfortunately, the clock said it before I did. The time is sort of up. So I want to thank again the members of the panel this afternoon, Gabriela, Margaret, and Edward, for 3 very interesting presentations.